The word culture comes from a very ancient word which means tillage. To culture is to cultivate, and to cultivate is to prepare the earth for the seed. Thus our word culture means land prepared to receive the seed. It also means, in a larger sense, land prepared for the harvest. That is, that from this cultured or cultivated soil, a better harvest will come. Men cultivated the soil in order to improve the harvest. And as this term gradually passed into idiom, we think of culture as preparing the way for a more elevated or more perfect standard of living. In other words, for a better harvest of attainments, of security, of peace, and all these good things which we seek. The word culture also implies discipline, inasmuch as what discipline is to the human personality, tillage is to the earth. For by discipline we prepare man for a better way of life, that he in turn may bring forth a greater harvest. The word conscience actually implies within its own structure the voice or testimonies of those internal and external evidences which lead to inevitable conclusions within the human mind. Thus, conscience is the summary of the testimony of experience. Our conscience is largely influenced by our culture. For seeking around us for standards of right and wrong, we are impressed by the prevailing habits of our times. Thus, to a degree, to go against tradition, to go against mass motion, either of these courses will cause some persons to have difficulties with their conscience. In other cases, conscience may rise defiant of traditional forms. Under such conditions, it bears witness to the individual decision or coordination of faculties within the person. Conscience is affected both by conduct and by culture. And culture is very largely the result of conscience and conduct. Thus, these three factors become a basic triangle acting upon each other and resulting in a compound or aggregate of elements or forces likely to influence strongly the life of each person. So this morning we want to more or less develop the idea on the level of personal action. That is, on the level of conduct. We observe every day that the average person does not have adequate control of his own conduct. In the words of St. Paul, when he would do good, evil is ever nigh unto him. And he is constantly compromising his own personally selected way of life. The reason why his conduct is not sustained by his inner nature is because his conduct is usually undisciplined. He has never made any conscientious effort to equip himself to sustain his own standard of conduct. Now, of course, we would all like to assume from an idealistic position that man can improve his conduct almost by wishing to do so. This is not strictly true. Our major trouble in life is not that we are failing to improve our conduct, but rather that we are failing to apply that level of conduct which we already possess, at least through appreciation or mental and emotional acceptance. Why then do we find that when conduct differs from immediate instinct, when conduct is contrary to self-interest or apparent self-interest, under any particular circumstance, we are more likely to compromise the conduct than we are to modify the self-interest? Probably emotional pressure is largely responsible for our condition. Collective culture is also heavily involved in the action of each individual, for society can penalize man for keeping faith with himself, and it can also reward him for compromising his own conscience. While this conflict remains, the necessity for cultivation or the deepening and strengthening of available character attributes, these motions are important. These recognitions are vital to our living. Conscience was for a long time held to be the voice of God in man. We have gradually failed to so sustain the definition. The reason being that if the voice of deity is the root of conscience, then there should be a gradual motion toward an identity of conscience concepts. Individuals seeking within themselves for guidance from conscience should come to similar, if not identical, convictions. This is not actually the case. The individual seeking within himself for moral support does not arrive at conclusions identical with the results of seeking in the lives of others. In other words, his conscience is a highly personal thing and must bear witness to the chemical compound of the testimonies of his faculties and powers. Thus, the individual's conscience does grow, does change. Many individuals today would not do things which they have done 5 or 10 years ago. Tomorrow we will find new standards of personal conduct which will be in advance of and probably inconsistent with the conscience standards of the majority of persons today. Thus, conscience is not merely an arbitrary oracle. It is not the power of a single universal purpose unfolding through the individual. Conscience is in substance the voice of man's attained characteristics, particularly those bearing upon his moral and ethical life. Thus, what the individual most sincerely believes to be true will establish conscience standards, and his greatest misfortune is when he comes in conflict with these. Modern psychology, studying the life of man, recognizes that it is difficult, in fact detrimental to the individual, to attempt to live contrary to his conscience, even though his conscience may be inadequate. It is therefore necessary, where internal conscience is the cause of trouble, for the person to re-educate or cultivate or attain a new level of culture within himself in order to safely modify the attitudes of conscience. We now do with a good conscience what our ancestors would have regarded as unpardonable. And our ancestors with a good conscience performed actions which we would regard as unpardonable. Thus these policies change. And in the world today, there is an infinite stratification of conscience. Various nations and races have different collective convictions about right and wrong. These are modified by the religions, the philosophies, the crafts and trades of people, and even by their climatic and geographic locations. Nearly everything outside of man contributes something to his conscience, if he is aware of this outside thing. And inside forces in turn contribute to his conscience. Normally speaking, the person of strong character finds it easier to differ from outside forces than from inside pressures. It is therefore not as difficult for him to attempt to resist environment as it is to resist instinct, or that part which emerges from his own nature. We have very little defense against any mood that rises within ourselves, but we have a natural instinct to defend ourselves against moods rising in others. Probably this is somewhat easier because we do not always basically agree with the moods of others, whereas we instinctively agree with our own moods, feeling them to be essentially important and different because they are ours. Thus conscience is in a constant state of being civilized or being cultured. And it is from the level upon which it functions that the personality receives its strongest directives toward the improvement of a material way of life. It is sometimes said that persons lack conscience. It is very doubtful if anyone actually lacks this faculty. He may really rename it or attribute it to other things. He may say that his code is not based upon himself, but upon utility. But his code then becomes his conscience, for any acceptance or rejection by himself creates a conscience level to which he instinctively and inevitably responds. To pretend or assume to have no conscience is itself a level of conscience, because this pressure is asserted by every compound within the nature of a growing structure. Now, conduct also demands our consideration. For in the life of the person, conduct is a constant process of adjustment. The conduct of the individual is a way of life calculated to bring with it the fulfillment of inner purpose and or the security of the body and its requirements. Thus conduct is for the most part the motion from within the individual of those directives which lead to action. The person's conduct is also under the censorship of what we might term the visible universe. Man can hold almost any concept which he desires, whether it be reasonable or unreasonable. But the moment a concept flows into conduct, the moment we apply the things we believe, we discover that they come under a factual censorship. They either prove beneficial or not beneficial, regardless of the regard in which we hold them. Thus we learn through experience that many ideas are not good or are not adequate. And history is the record of the conduct of individuals and collectives. And from history we learn that great patterns of conduct have disappeared, vanished utterly, because they could not survive the test of time. Other patterns have been modified, and in the course of time, new patterns have appeared, which have been sustained by necessity, and have demonstrated their utility. Thus, conduct is a way by which each individual is constantly creating an experimental laboratory in which to apply his convictions to his problems. Through his conduct, if he is an intelligent person, he becomes increasingly aware of the validity of his own beliefs, of his own ideas. And he also becomes more aware of the degree of his own cultivation. He will say, in this particular incident, I know what I should have done, but I did not have the strength to do it. Or in this emergency, what I knew was inadequate. Or looking back upon the incident, I know how I should have conducted myself. These are informative consequences. And if the person is open-minded, reasonable, and intelligent, he will gradually learn lessons, which in turn will affect conscience, which in turn will affect conduct, and this in turn becomes the basis of his personal culture. So these relate together in a very intimate arrangement and in the descent of values from a hypothetical center to a hypothetical circumference. Now, culture itself we must re-estimate also. Nearly every human being wishes to be regarded as cultured. When he says this, he is actually telling us that he wishes to be regarded as a self-regulated creature. He wishes his friends and his enemies, his associates, his neighbors, and even strangers to say of him, this person governs himself. Now that is the essential meaning of the term. It means that this person has within himself resources sufficient to meet the needs of his outer living. On this basis, we sort of have to pause, because on such a ground, many persons broadly and rather incorrectly regarded as cultured may not be so. Today we consider a person who has achieved a certain polish in arts, who has attained social graces, who eats with the correct instruments, who is familiar with the social dicta of Emily Post, that such a person is refined and cultured. We are almost certain of it if he is soft-voiced and successful. This combination is irresistible to our thinking. Actually, to be cultured means to be refined. And what does refined mean? It simply means to have passed through processes by which gross elements or dross has been removed from a material. In other words, refined does not mean, as in our case, that all the life has been taken out of it, but rather that it has been brought to a condition of purity. Refinement, then, essentially is compatible with culture. But refinement is not merely the exhibition of either hereditary or acquired graces. Refinement is purification through effort, through the individual actually attaining a high degree of self-discipline. Now, culture as self-discipline from the individual position must lead on to collective culture, because true culture, enduring culture, means a state in which those evils which we now dread and fear no longer exist, or at least are so completely controlled that they can never break forth to produce a holocaust of some kind. In this meaning, therefore, a culture is a collective composed of cultured individuals. A culture, like democracy, is only possible when each individual is a self-governing unit. This means that we must have the burden of certain authorities pressing in upon us until we are able to so conduct ourselves that there is no need for supervision. What we call society today is a supervised way of life. And the fact that it is supervised means that the elements composing it have not reached cultural maturity. The problem of reformation, the regenerations of society, the changes of the great ways of life, must result from the maturing of collectives and the units of which they are composed. To mature an individual means that we must bring his resources to a condition in which they are sufficient to his need. Thus we must bring in the harvest. For the harvest actually means that from the earth we have gained an abundance. And in culture, from the resources, the natural substances of our natures, we have brought forth an abundance of character by which we are able to do all things sufficiently. Thus again, culture for the person is maturity, integration, the result of constant effort, constant watchfulness, constant self-leadership. We are supplied with the faculties and powers making this leadership possible. But up to the present time, we have not given it adequate consideration. To suggest that the individual should devote more attention to himself and less attention to externals is to be regarded as reactionary, to be assumed to be a vague idealist, or at best to be merely preaching. Actually, the individual's present place in society is an indictment of his level of conduct. And while he is too busy and so disinterested that he has no mind or heart for discipline, at the same time he is raising his voice in constant wailing against the infirmities of his times. He is dissatisfied and unhappy, living in a state of constant mental and emotional criticism and rebellion. Yet while thus defining in one way his requirements, he at the same time denies the only way in which he can attain these acquirements, namely self-discipline, or the integration of the individual around a sufficient code of conduct. So culture for the average person is either a situation existing around him as a result of collective action, or a situation or condition existing within him and moving into his most immediate environment as the result of his own code or his own degree of attainment. The great unit of collective conduct is composed of a common pressure. Man has a smaller field of action, and the conduct patterns of each person extend through himself to those in his immediate circle. Thus, probably the largest conduct pattern of the individual is his personal life in relation to his business and his home and his own character. It follows, therefore, that through his association with others in employment, his association with himself in his tastes and his desires, his interests, and association with his home and family as his responsibility, or the sphere in which his energies have the greatest authority, these determine the sufficiency of his culture. For this reason, there has been a great tendency on the part of dissatisfied persons to jump quickly across this interval composed of self, family, and business, and dash on to the greater unknown of collective humanity. It seems much more desirable to pass laws for others to live by than to try to live by any laws ourselves. And always appeared, perhaps, that we cannot prove in action what we believe. We cast our convictions upon great bodies, where they sink like pebbles and we no longer see their consequences. Thus we can continue to believe erroneously as long as we refrain from testing our belief within the sphere of our own recognitions. The immediate problem of growth, then, is a problem of conduct. And the individual who is able to prove his conduct in his own personal life and in his immediate environment is in the lead as far as cultural achievements are concerned. Now we must ask, undoubtedly, for a code of conduct. What should we do instead of what we do? Now, if we apply a code from the outside, from the collective, upon the individual, we are then in the presence of a number of good examples of such codes. Examples, some of which have had great testing in time. We have, for example, the earliest of all the great legal and judicial codes of the world, the code of the ancient Sumerian king Hammurabi. We also have the code of Justinian, arising about the 6th century of our own era. We have the Mosaic Code, arising probably between 13 and 1500 years BC. We have a simple code, such as the Sermon on the Mount. Later, we have the Code Napoleon. And in a larger and more general way, we have the Magna Carta and the American Bill of Rights. These are various aspects of codes, but they are largely, in their more beneficial aspects, protective devices created primarily to assist the individual to have the opportunity and the possibility of creating his own code. These bills, these laws, these legislations are to equip man for the cultivation of his own character and to protect his right to do so. Thus, we cannot say that the average person can accept merely the letter of other codes or of world codes. He must live within them to create patterns of collective security. He must obey them until he attains a state within himself in which he is no longer by instinct capable of violating those basic rights which not only protect him from others, but protect others from him. Thus, these larger codes become the foundations of broad policies. And to a degree, these codes have become foundations of conscience within the person. Thus, codes contribute to conscience. These codes have often been theologized, either on a religious level or on a political level. And we must not overlook the fact that for many people, a political level is sacred, or is, to their philosophy of life, the equivalent of a spiritual level. A person may be as completely, and sometimes as unreasonably, addicted to political convictions as he is to religious convictions. So a code is something which man instinctively desires to defend. He often finds it easier to go out and die for it on a battlefield than to stay home and live with it in his personal life. So there is a great deal of flag waving about codes, and they are better defended than used. This is because the defense of them is heroism. The use of them is restriction. The individual is forced to modify the excesses of his own disposition. Codes, then, have as their basis a revelation of moral ethics or ethical morality. They are intended to summarize the experience of man on the adventure of living. They tell what we have learned through long and arduous periods. And they also reveal those amendments which we have found necessary to previous codes, not only due to the weaknesses of those codes, but of the inevitable changings and vicissitudes of time. So by degrees we have built collective codes, but we have not, with equal clarity, perfected personal codes or internal codes. When you read the magnificent language of Hammurabi, even in the ancient writings, taken from the daggerform, cuneiform inscription, you realize that even in this ancient day, probably nearly 5,000 years ago, the collective code had already been raised to a magnificent sense of dignity. There was a strong and beautiful statement of human rights. And let us not imagine for a moment that the Roman law was without justice, or the Greek law without integrity. These codes were noble, particularly in the light of their own time. And many of their essential principles are unchanged even to this day. So after 5,000 years of living under codes of increasing enlightenment, we turn to the individual suddenly and we say to him, what is your code of life? That stops him. He will pause for a moment and say, well, the way I look at it is that the only thing you can do is do the best you can. Now that sums it up. And you say to an individual, what have you built your life on? Oh, well, I've just always tried to be reasonably fair, be as good as conditions as would permit. One man told me once he has been as honest as his economic condition permitted. So, it is rare indeed to find a person who can give you a clear, simple statement of his own code. Try it sometime. Take a piece of paper and write down your 10 commandments. Don't copy them from someone, but copy them from the concept of what you believe to be right, what experience has shown you, what you would regard as the basic code of integrity. Say, limiting each of these 10 brackets to, say, 100 words. Sum it up. And when you've got it all nicely summed up, ask yourself how close you're coming to it. And I warn you that for selfish and highly personal reasons, you had better consider that before you start writing. Because if you just really state what you really believe, and then take a good look at yourself, you're likely to be pretty much embarrassed. Because you will find, by this simple procedure, that your own standard is far higher than your conduct. And for this interval, you sort of must find an explanation. So you say to yourselves, well, I think I could have lived up to it on this occasion if it hadn't been for that very unpleasant relative of mine. They were so nasty that the only thing I could do was be nasty too. So we begin to find escapes from our own codes. But actually, what progress has been made in collective society has been largely due to the gradual codification and integration of an unfolding concept of ethics. The same is true in the life of the person. A clear code. A code, however, which is not dogmatic, that is not regarded as an infallible, which can never be changed even when it's outgrown, but a simple natural code, suitable to daily need, clearly stated and strongly held. This will help a great many persons to recognize their own strength, their own weakness, and their own inconsistency. Such a procedure is very helpful, very well inclined to clarify the confusion in ourselves. There is also this problem as to what part of our inner nature should be the basis of leadership. What should we be led by? Well, empirically, the answer is the same as that given by Socrates. The best should lead the rest. But it doesn't always happen politically, I've noticed, and it doesn't always happen in the individual. And one of the first problems, both politically and individually, is trying to determine what is the best. Our attitudes on this subject are highly prejudiced. Our candidate is the best, and our desire at the moment is the best. For we determine that to be best, which most satisfies our present purposes, and not what is essentially good. So we're searching within ourselves for the basis of leadership. We turn to the mind, and we're not so sure. It is certain that the mind is the most skillful of our instruments, but it is also the most tricky. And an individual can reason himself in and out of reality with great ease and skill. By means of the mind, he can justify any failing that he has. And he can also condemn others for any virtue they may possess. Thus the mind is not always an adequate instrument. So we say the heart. Well, that would be very good if we knew what that was. To us, in general, the heart is the seat of sentimentality. And sentimentality is that peculiar reaction within us by which we are always sorry for ourselves and hypersensitive of what others do to us and completely indifferent to what we do to them. Now this perhaps is an overstatement, because that certainly isn't the basic intention of emotion. But that is the way it works out in those personalities where codes of conduct are still most necessary. So by the heart we may mean emotion. And we are not sure whether this emotion is strong enough to lead us. It is not strong enough to help us to discipline our own children. Because if we become a little too fond of them, we spoil them. And in spoiling them, we injure them in the name of love. So we're not too sure that what we call love has been sufficiently cultivated, that is disciplined, to be available to us as a constructive power in an emergency. So we cannot say that the body would be the basis of a suitable code. The body is interested in survival and comfort. If we live by that code, we are just about on the lowest rung of the ladder. So what do we do? The answer seems to be that the powers of the mind, the intensities of the emotions, combined with numerous other apperceptive faculties and instincts, intuition, all come together to form an aggregate, a kind of collective consciousness. And that this, a sort of compound testimony, is about all we have to work with. And the pressure of that, the pressure of our minds and our emotions and our habits, our interests, our activities, our likes and dislikes, our beliefs and unbeliefs, our convictions and lack of convictions, all these things rolled into one, gain a kind of collective entity. And the voice of this collective entity we call conscience. Now conscience sometimes truly makes cowards of us, but on other occasions it can make us heroes. Conscience, however, is most valuable, perhaps, simply because it reveals something. the instinctive pressure to do a certain thing, a belief that this thing must be or should be done, is itself a testimony to our levels of integration. And where our conscience is below the level of our society and is expressed through destructive or antisocial tendencies, it means that the individual has failed to reach the level of culture to which he belongs. This definitely indicates that he will suffer from unadjustment and that he will consequently be under stress because he cannot or has not kept up with the common ethical living of his time. If his conscience dictates a way of life superior to the collective culture of his day, then he is reminded of the importance of a decision whether he shall define well-being as conformity with conscience or conformity with culture. In this case, I mean by culture the existing level. If the individual is heavily influenced by his environment, if he desires to be rewarded or appreciated or understood or applauded by those around him, if his personal security depends upon public approbation, if he is more interested in others' opinions of him than he is of his opinion of himself, then he must compromise conscience and cling to the cultural level of his time. If, conversely, his own internal values are more meaningful, then he must be prepared for the adjustments which he must make in his social relationships. Now this presents us with another problem. The individual wishes to live by the best of his own standard, but he apparently usually is not strong enough to withstand the criticism of his environment. Therefore, he has to estimate his own standards again. If integrities within the person are real, they are the source of his satisfaction. If they are not real, then externals remain the principal source of his satisfaction. The individual who finds a serious conflict and finding he wishes to do certain things cannot withstand the pressure of environment is not strong enough. Nor is he strong enough if he finds that the decision to be true to himself results in martyrdom. If he must go on and tell us for the rest of his life how he suffers for his principles, he doesn't have them. Because if the principles were strong, he would rejoice in his principles. If his principles are not sufficiently strong, then he is actually acting contrary to his basic instinct. And this is the cause of misery, even if the action itself appears to be highly commendable. There is no demand on the part of nature that anyone should be miserable in order to be good. All that is required is that the individual should cultivate or culture those parts of his own nature in which leadership rests. And when he does this correctly, he finds himself naturally and pleasantly impelled to courses of action that are self-rewarding. Therefore, there is no need for him to feel that he is a sacrificing, frustrated, inhibited creature simply because he is law-abiding, either obeying the law around him or the law within him. Now, the term law is difficult because with us it is associated semantically with a situation that may not always be just. And we rebel against laws which we regard as unreasonable. But universal law is never unreasonable and never requires rebellion. It requires only understanding. And understanding is a harvest of conduct. It results from the experience of the being as this unfolds in the sphere of activities. So let us go back for a moment now and consider this problem of conscience as it relates to a collective pressure in man by which he levels off into a code of action. This conscience also is subject to interpretation. If conscience could simply speak, exercise itself, reveal itself in its natural way, then like instinct, of which it is the overtone, it would direct man as instinct directs the animal. The animal cannot disobey nature. It has no faculties or powers to do so. Nor can it resist those energies and pressures natural to its kind. Therefore, an animal can neither be good nor evil. But man, possessing a power of personal decision, may be either good or evil, and therefore has the right to choose to flee from the good, from the evil, and cling to the good. Thus man in his own nature has this polarized instinct, but he also has a mind and he has emotions. And these move in on instinct almost immediately. They begin the modification of it. And when an individual's instinctual code tells him to do something, his mind may step in and warn him that it is hazardous. Or his emotions may tell him that it will be penalized. Therefore, by degrees, he permits his natural, intuitive instincts, his conscience, to be conditioned or educated away from its own integrities. He will assume an attitude and say, well, it's all very well to have this feeling, but it is obviously impractical. Therefore, we will not do it. Or it is natural that the individual should live peacefully, but under the prevailing circumstances, it seems more desirable to live in a militant state. So men speak of peace and practice war. And in ourselves we speak of gentleness and practice anger, because we have applied a rule of expediency to a code of character. Out of this expediency procedure, we generally come to one of two conclusions. Namely, we censor our own conscience or our own code until we withdraw or remove from it nearly everything which would powerfully affect our living. or else through an intensity we specialize some phase of it unreasonably, often specializing some phase which has direct bearing upon ourselves and is somewhat to our credit. Like the familiar story of the individual who, arriving at the pearly gates after a rather unpleasant life, met the keeper of the book and went over the records. It was discovered that this person had been a miserable nuisance from the cradle to the grave, had been an embodiment of the adversary for everyone and everything this person had come in contact with. A miserable disposition and a complete self-centeredness of living. But before the final total, the keeper of the book said, "Is there not something that you can think of that would justify your salvation?" And after a little while, the soul came up with a smile and said, "Yes, I was very kind to my cat." So in the process of conscience, we generally pick upon one or two virtues which are not difficult, to which we are naturally inclined, and assume that we can accumulate enough credit from those to sort of go on our way. But gradually we do dilute by reasoning and argument, by so-called justification. We dilute the structure of our natural psychic impulse. All of these elements mean that we cannot simply sit down and depend upon our inner lives to lead us victoriously through this misfortune. We must recognize that there is a potential by which we can achieve internal leadership. But without its particular cultivation and development, it will not operate. Thus, culture becomes the basis, collectively, of a group of institutions which have arisen for the purpose of advancing collective culture through the improvement of individual culture. Prominent among such institutions is education. Education, theoretically, is created to assist man to achieve a state of cooperation, or to become an informed member of a composite body which for its survival depends upon powerful cooperative elements. Education, to the average person, is little better than a bore. And there is a revolt against education in many directions because it obviously does not fit the individual for self-discipline. But it makes a valiant contribution if he is willing to accept it. And that contribution is that the individual, under discipline, does gain certain lessons that are valuable to him. The discipline of learning being perhaps vastly more important than that which is learned. Very often in living, school is the only discipline that the individual has during his lifetime. He was undisciplined probably in his home, or inadequately and too personally dominated. He is undisciplined in his life when starting out he builds his own career. And from the point of maturity it is increasingly difficult to discipline him, because he is addicted to the conviction of the value of his own rugged individualism. He wishes to do as he pleases, and as a citizen feels that he is entitled. to the rights of liberty and self-action. Very often then, from the cradle to the grave, the individual knows no discipline except that which is imposed in the classroom. Others, of course, find later discipline in business. And while we are forever decrying the miseries of the economic system, they again force the individual by necessity, by the needs of his own physical survival, to perform regular actions and to work, an ailment which has afflicted a great part of humanity from an early time. The average person does not want to work. At least he does not think he does. Actually, if work ceased, there would in a few months be a wild scurry to find some, because the human being simply cannot live without activities and directed interests. He would like to direct his own interests, but if he had the opportunity, he would discover that he cannot. Only a very few can be successfully self-employed. Thus, school and perhaps business, and later the home, are disciplining factors. But school is important because it disciplines at an early age. It teaches the individual processes of regular procedure, by means of which he gains a certain ability to reason things through, to move from causes to effects, and to advance sequentially in the unfoldment of knowledge or ideas. The school becomes a way of discipline, as it was originally intended. For the old Greeks called their schools gymnasiums, because they were places for exercising the mind and the psychic nature, just as we would strengthen the body by reasonable rhythmic exercise. So exercise is self-discipline. Discipline is culture. And culture enriches the conduct of the individual. Society also offers other cultural advantages, as mingling together in the appreciation of arts, in the advancement of sciences, in the development of sanitation, in the combat of disease, and many other things. So culture collectively does grow, but it grows largely through the creativity of individuals. Less than 10,000 names are known out of the billions who have lived. And probably the greater part of culture is due to the pressure of these 10,000 persons. This does not mean that the unknown have not contributed, but it means that the contributions of the unknown have largely been contributions of support rather than creativity. They have supported progress, defended it, died for it, and in this way have made their valid contribution to the collective good. In man, as only 1 in 1,000 perhaps, will possess the immediate resources to attempt the advancement of conduct. Others will attempt to sustain the conduct patterns that have been established by home, by church, by school, and by life. To sustain these patterns is to protect the individual's integration in society, but not necessarily to protect his internal well-being. Where conduct, conscience, and culture fail within the person, we have danger of a psychotic state. For most mental and emotional disease are the result of the failure of disciplinatory patterns within the individual. The person who is not self-ruled is therefore in danger of coming under the domination of something or someone else. We pity the individual who is evidently dominated by another person. We do not, however, recognize the doleful spectacle of an individual who is not dominated by the total integration of himself. If he is dominated only by the pressures of a part of his personality, we call him one-pointed. We consider him a unified being. He is not united. He is not governed by a total representation of the people. He is governed by one isolated faculty, taking a dictatorial attitude over the others. Wherever the total integration does not govern, we do not have a democratic state. We do not have an administration that is truly protective and directional. So where the self-discipline is absent, man's government falls under a tyranny of some kind. Such a tyranny is fear. Another is worry. A third is grief. Perhaps another is over-possessiveness, or another ambition. But these are the tyrannies of unbalanced faculties and powers, which are detrimental to the integration of the person, either in relation to his own nature or his socialization in society. So the person who is not cultivated, that is, has not been prepared for the sowing of the seed of maturity, will nearly always get into trouble. When a man decides to cultivate land, it used to be in the old days, perhaps, that he went out into a wild frontier, and here he took to himself such acreage as he and perhaps his sons could work. Perhaps he took 100 acres, 500 acres. Or as in the days of the old Southwest, the caballeros on their horses rode out and rode around as much land as they could cover in a day, and that was their property. Now, after this achievement and the hypothetical establishment of boundary, came the process of working the land. The first thing that had to be done was to clear it, because it was covered with a wild shrubbery of its own. There was nothing wrong with that shrubbery. There was nothing wrong with the forests that covered the fields. They were wonderful, they were beautiful, but they were not according to the purpose of the man who had secured the land. Therefore, it was up to him to clear that land. Man, experimenting with his own body, with his own nature, with his own temperament, finds that he has an area of land or an area of personal property which requires cultivation. He has inherited it in a virginal state. It is still covered with primordial forest, or perhaps in a more desolate region with nothing but cactus and dry, brittle, sharp things. But it is his duty to clear it. So he blows out the stumps. He cuts down the trees. He piles up the boulders to make fences. He must redeem his land. And he'll work hard for 160 acres. And so will his sons, and their sons after them, until finally, one day, we see the golden harvest swaying in the light breeze of autumn. And we know the farmer is the master of his land. But in order to achieve that mastery, he has been mastered by it, and by its responsibilities and its duties, perhaps for generations. In the same way, man inherits this thing he calls his potential temperament, disposition, or character. He must then go to work upon it. He must clear away the rock. He must also fence his land to know the field of his own responsibility. He must gradually prepare it for useful purpose. Now, it's very probable that the farmer would not have gone through all these problems had he not needed the physical means of sustaining his family. Thus he worked from day to dark. Thus he struggled through the years, depriving himself of nearly every cultural advantage in order merely to protect and improve his land. Man has not yet realized that the problem of the protection of his inner life is an equally tremendous equation. Nor has he realized that even when he prepared this land physically and supplied his family, he could still fail them, and fail them tremendously. They became merely units of labor. They lost their share in the beauty of the world. They worked, but their minds had little chance to grow, their souls little opportunity to build into a larger concept of life. They were limited utterly. As this continues, man knows that he must add cultural growth to other forms of growth. He must mature and cultivate this field of his own soul, because it produces a harvest without which his soul will die. And if beauty dies in him, if truth dies in him, if love dies in him, for lack of cultivation, then there is no amount of physical prosperity that can preserve him, any more than there is any amount of skill that can save this civilization if integrity dies. In the person, therefore, the requirements of culture are not selfish. He is not improving himself merely for his own sake, but because all survival depends upon it, and particularly the integrity of those with whom he will come in contact, the home he will build, the business he will manage. The success and integration and value of these things depend upon him and his own cultural standard. So he works his field to bring forth a harvest of ripe, mature understanding. He builds for strength. Strength to do the right, as it is given to him to know the right. Strength to cling to principle in the presence of temptation. Strength to go straight along the road that leads to ultimate security. This is not, however, always even a choice that he can make. There are not several ways in which he can survive, only one. Failure to make this adjustment, failure to grow, brings him under the despotism of psychosis. Every compromise leads ultimately to mental disease. Mental disease is not always an acute pathology. Sometimes the most terrible diseases of all are never diagnosed and never recognized. Fear is a disease, more terrible than those for which we are constantly raising money. Worry is a disease, contagious and infectious, that can go on through life, rotting out the psychic life, destroying its value, and bringing the person finally to a frustration of everything that is really important to them. Criticism is a disease, even though we may not regard it as a pathology in our way of life. A disease is merely some abnormal or unreal condition arising within an organism. The natural state of the body is health. Disease is artificial to man. The natural state of man's inner life is happiness. Misery is artificial to him. But just as his physical conduct has led to disease for ages, because he rejected the laws of normal living, so his psychic conduct has led to misery for ages, because he has rejected the basic laws of happiness. These things he must understand and must recognize that growth releases him and prepares him like the good soil for the richest of harvests. Now we have noticed in farming recently the importance of diversifying a crop. We realize that we can exhaust a soil by demanding that it bring forth every year the same kind of harvest. The same is true of man. We exhaust man by the over-specialization of his attributes. By binding the individual completely to a specialization, we deplete the psychic soil of his life. Sometimes he rebels through avocational addictions. He finds compensatory outlets for himself. He must. Because to do the same thing forever is as bad for the soul of man as the same crop forever is bad for the earth. So from nature we learn constantly laws relating to our own living. And we gradually recognize that conduct is not only doing right, but doing right wisely and intelligently. When an individual says they did the right thing and have come to grief as the result, we usually find that their action was unreasonable, that they did not approach their subject and their problem intelligently as well as honestly. So we have faculties to make these equations possible, so that we may do all things well, and as well as honestly. In the person then, today, when an individual achieves cultural progress, let us not assume that this is selfish. Let us assume that this cultural advancement, like every other change within man, is going to have far-reaching effects. Luther Burbank once told me that the level or cycle of recurrent heredities in plants is 11 generations. In other words, if two plants of different colors are cross-pollinized, there may be from this a certain number of plants selected and again interpollinized or pollinized with their own kind. This may continue for 10 cycles, and the interpollinizing will show only the results that might be expected. But at the 11th interpollinizing, the heterogeneous factor present in the first one reappears. In other words, if you take for instance 2 roses, a white one and a pink one. You pollinize these, and of the product, some will be pink, some will be white, and some will be varicolored. You will then take a white one from this group and pollinize it with white again. The product will usually be white. From this take one and pollinize with white again, and continue with white 11 times. And on the 11th pollinization, the pink will come back. Now this was his experience. Now, Let us apply this to the individual. Let us assume that by a distinct action of our own, by what we term culture, cultivation, we make a prominent and definite change within ourselves, so that in the course of a lifetime, we transcend our own beginnings, that we actually make a valid contribution to the improvement of our own conduct, the clarification of our own conscience, the cultivation of our own living. We become more conscious of fine things, develop stronger integrities, and gradually improve ourselves. This means that we will have a greater heritage to pass on to those who come after us. Now it may well follow that we will not have made all these improvements before we reach biological parenthood. So we cannot say that our children will inherit the maturity of our living, but they will inherit the example of that maturity growing with them, and will be influenced by that maturity, even though perhaps only a part of it will be an hereditary asset. But young children growing up in a growing home of people dedicated to constructive growth, natural, happy, honorable people, are receiving a rich heritage. A very different heritage from these homes where pathos, burden, responsibility, and conflict are forever present. We know that this legacy lives. We know from experiences and from records relating to backgrounds of families that your family background, as you live it today, will not only influence a vast future, but will recur perhaps almost in totality in the 11th generation from now. And based upon present values, we can say that counting relations, interrelations, and contacts, others brought into our stream through marriage and association and coming strongly under the influence of our hereditary patterns, that a definite improvement in the American home today will not cease to operate for a long time, and that one good pair of parents bringing their children up intelligently, beautifully, and constructively will have a distinct and definite effect upon over 250,000 human beings. Why then should we insist that private virtues are selfish? They are not selfish. They are the only virtues which are available to anyone else through themselves or from their own internal life, because that is where this power is placed. So the improvements of conduct and conscience and the resulting changes upon culture cannot be estimated. But we are given not only this long-range optimistic outlook, we are given the immediate fact that progress in culture is a present help and a true symbol of such superiority as man is capable of attaining. The non-competitive superiority resulting from growth itself. Growth is one thing, maturity is one thing that we can have more of without anyone else having less. The growth of the individual is not achieved at the expense of others, but to their benefit as well as his own. He does not deprive anyone else when he becomes a better person. Therefore, those treasures of man which alone have true value are never competitive. And no matter how much happiness we gain, true happiness, reasonable happiness, we should make no one else unhappy. In fact, our happiness should contribute to a general happiness. Throughout life, cultivation brings with it patterns of security. The cultured human being is adjustable to need, ready to see the opportunity for self-improvement. He is not opinionated. He is not dogmatic. He is therefore not nearly so likely to come under the psychic pressures which must afflict all stubborn people. For what we commonly term today frustration is nothing more or less than obstruction to the purposes of the ego. And where we come in conflict, we are injured. Conflicts exist on the level of ignorance. About things we do not understand, we are in constant misunderstanding. But where we have come to levels of internal conduct maturity, our understanding helps us to serve what we know to be true, and at the same time gives us a depth of understanding for those whose vision or viewpoint is not the same as ours. So pressures are lowered, life becomes more meaningful, and conscience is clarified because it is no longer the victim of the ulterior pressures of mind and emotion. The person then gains the possibility of coordination. And through this coordination, the possibility of a normal, constructive life. And in this kind of living, he finds not only personal satisfaction, but the largest probability of cooperative relationship with other persons. He finds himself enriched in values which are real, permanent, and socially useful. Well, time's up.